And we are live, it appears. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and spending a little bit of time, your lunch break perhaps, with us. My name is Sarah Gottwallis, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. It is my esteemed honor and pleasure to be presenting to you today a survivor child, a gentleman whose parents were both survivors in the Holocaust. His name is Saul Awend. And Saul is going to be sharing with us today the story of both of his parents, as well as a little bit of insight of what it was like to grow up as the child of two Holocaust survivors. It's a very interesting story, one that we're really just starting to hear. We've heard from some survivors over the decades, and now the children and perhaps even the grandchildren are coming forth and sharing their story as well. So on that note, I won't take up any more of Saul's time. I just want to welcome him. Thank you so much, Saul, for speaking to us. Floor is yours. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to post those into the YouTube chat, and I will relay those to Saul once we are finished. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to be here today, and I humbly thank you for your interest. My sincere thanks to Sarah Gottwallis, Stephen Bianco, and to Florida Southwestern State College for their help in preparing this program and their diligence in keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. Considering what's going on in the Ukraine, I want you to know that I am not comparing what happened to my family to what is going on in the Ukraine today. They're both terrible events, and they never should have happened. I became aware of the Holocaust at a young age, believing this terrible event happened only because my family was Jewish. Growing older, I came to understand that the Holocaust happened more because of ignorance and hatred. My family came from Poland, home to Jews for more than 1,000 years. My brother Abe recently completed a 4-year-long research project on our family, he and I even going to Poland to see firsthand from where we came and where we lost so much. My mother was born and raised in the town of Skarżysko, Poland, about 60 miles from Warsaw. Her mother and father raised 9 children. They lived a happy and boisterous life, filled with the beauty of Yiddishkeit, of being Jewish. My grandfather, Aaron, was a builder and a businessman. My grandmother, Sarah, ran the household and provided a Jewish foundation for living. They spoke Yiddish and were respected in both Jewish and non-Jewish circles. The last time my mother and grandmother saw one another was on the second day of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. It was October 1941. Dinah was working 12-hour days in a local ammunition plant and not allowed to go home anymore. The handwriting was on the wall, and sadly, Sarah told her daughter to be strong, to be honest, and tearfully they parted. Dinah later learned from local townspeople that the Jews were being rounded up and sent to the Treblinka death camp. Sarah was defiant and refused to go. She was shot in the street in front of her house while Aaron and 6 children would take that fateful trip and never be heard from again. 2 older family members went their separate ways to different countries and survived. Dinah would work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week under terrible conditions for more than a year. She and a cousin, Luba, would be hauled around to different camps and suffer terrible living conditions, once being on a transport from Bergen-Belsen to Dachau for 5 days with no food or water. And by the war's end, Dinah was on a death march suffering from typhus. She laid down and finally decided to give up. A shadow fell across her face, and fearing the worst, she opened her eyes and saw the face of an American soldier. In disbelief, she realized that she had survived. My father, Barak, came from the predominantly Jewish town of Auschwitz. Along with his parents, Solomon and Mina, they had 3 brothers and 1 sister. The war broke out, and because the town had an important railhead, the Germans changed its complexion and turned it into the greatest graveyard in history, Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was sent there, imprisoned, and tattooed with a number. His entire family, except for his sister, would all perish. Before the war ended, he would be transferred to 4 other camps and liberated in Dachau. He helped bury the dead who were littered carelessly in the countryside. His sister Frida would experience her own terror and fear being liberated from Bergen-Belsen and later joined her brother in Feldafing and there meeting her future husband, Oleg. I don't know much about my dad. Any memory I have is nothing more than staring at a brick wall. Another man played a crucial role in my life. His name was Joseph Coopermans. Faithfully, he would become my second father. He came from Lodz, one of Poland's big industrial cities. He came from an Orthodox family, and his father died in 1924, but everyone else was overcome in Auschwitz, including Joseph's own wife and child. They suffered in the Lodz ghetto, being one of its first residents, and in August 1944 became one of its last. They were shipped to Auschwitz, and only Joseph made it through the life and death selection process. And at war's end, Joseph unknowingly saved some 1,000 people and wound up in the mountains of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, half dead and beaten to a pulp. These 3 people, Dinah, Barak, and Joseph, eventually wound up in Feldafing, Germany, not far from Munich and not far from Dachau. The Americans had set up a displaced persons camp for Jewish survivors who literally had nowhere to go. Even Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower would visit and be honored with a Torah presentation and ceremony. Dinah got a job in the kitchen. To help keep order, Barak would join the police force while continuing his vocation of being a barber. Joseph was a furniture craftsman with no reason to practice his trade and lived in Munich. Dinah was told by her boss of Barak, a fine Jewish fellow with whom he'd grown up. Dinah agreed to meet him. Mutual attraction turned to love, and they were married on November 29th, 1945, a fateful day. In 1947, I was born, a twin. My brother was stillborn. I had my own ailments, and ironically, doctors told the women survivors that they would have great difficulty having children because of the trauma they had endured. But for some 2 years, Feldafing had the highest per capita birth rate in the world. And it seemed that Jewish people were more interested in creating new lives and starting new futures rather than taking out rage and anger on their tormentors. Shortly after I was born, my father became ill with digestive problems. By the time he died at age 31, he'd been through 3 major surgeries and would die of cancer on his 4th wedding anniversary, November the 29th. He is buried in a Jewish cemetery there in Feldafing in a proper grave and with a proper headstone. It's important to understand that at the time, everyone was looking for a way out of Germany and where to relocate. Dinah's hope was to leave a proper monument for her son to visit when he grew up. A young widow, Dinah went through the bewildering task of dealing with the future. Her fate was decided by a woman from UNRWA. No husband and a child, she was asked. You'll never make it in Israel. You are going to America. Joseph, meanwhile, would find his own way out of Germany and also came to America. Leaving Germany in January 1951 on a 10-day ocean voyage across an angry Atlantic Ocean, my mom and I wound up in New Orleans, Louisiana, with St. Louis, Missouri as our ultimate destination. Joseph would also wind up there some 4 months later. He struggled with English and got a job in a major hotel, finally practicing his trade of building furniture. Being Jewish was still important to him, and he hoped to find a wife to create his own legacy that was so terribly wrenched from him. Dinah's main concern was for her child's welfare and that perhaps she too could find happiness with a mate. There was a sizable survivor network, and she was introduced to Joseph as a possible match. They were married after a short courtship, and a year later, to the day, my brother Abe was born on my birthday, July 10th. I tell you this story so you might better understand that growing up was tumultuous. Emotions in our house ran hot. Frustrations of getting used to living here. My parents' memories of before the war and of the war itself all took its toll. Being Jewish was of prime importance and colored our life. My brother and I were close. Because my parents worked long hours, I was responsible for his well-being. The American dream came true for my family, but it was fraught with a tremendous outpouring of emotion. There was misunderstandings, the difference in ages, and the arrogance of my youth. There was the dynamic of a blended family, living as strangers, nervous and always on the edge of confrontation. There were many heated arguments that plagued our family. In the end, it led to my mom becoming sick and suffering through 10 surgeries in her life. But through it all, she had a great smile and a zest for living. We were taught to do good, to not look for trouble and avoid it when possible. Humor prevailed many times when it could have gone the other way. And food. Food was so important. Always thought of first, shared, and never wasted. In the summer, survivors would get together for picnics. After a cheerful lunch, the kids would all run away to play. I hung back and would listen to stories of what these simple people went through just for who they were, Jews. I grew up in America and became a citizen. I partook of my country's bounty and tried to be an upstanding citizen. I became educated here and married a wonderful woman who gave me 2 great sons, who also got college degrees and followed me into business. I grew up speaking Yiddish. It was my first language and I love it. Having spent my spare time journaling and eventually developing a knack for poetic self-expression. Kishmir in Yiddish is a podcast I recently developed. It can be easily found and is hopefully worth listening to. The world is not unlike how it was some 81 years ago. Times are faster, knowledge is readily available, and almost nothing is hidden from view. Even though so much is the same, the violence, the greed, and the brutality of it all. I have a poem to share with you that tries to describe that. But then as now, there seems to be no solution to our trouble. This is the story of a tipsy fellow in a bar that waxes about his view on life. It's called Der Philosoph, or the philosopher. Der Philosoph by Saul Awend. Sitzt in einer Taverne allgens und sauft. Ungetrinken hypt up mit sein Philosoph. He is sitting in a tavern somewhere and drinks. Drunk, he starts with his philosophy. Zoekt als de Welt bij hem is niet geta weggesteld. He says that the world, according to him, is not sitting properly. Kijkt zich erin. De Welt, zoekt is takke grim. He looks around. The world, he says, is actually crooked. Was oft darf ot nicht, oder de pur groschen, oder a kish. He that needs doesn't have, or a few cents, or a kiss, oder der Gesind, de Wahl kimmt up, amul humme at sind, or health. But meanwhile, war shows up on the horizon. Was ot will mehr. Was ot nicht, wird bannen das Leben schwer. He who has wants more. He who doesn't, his life becomes so heavy. Begandet tukken bij de nacht, en a fillet de gitte, het oog het slacht. Stealing goes on day and night. Even the good ones are bad. Gott, schon lang verlot. God, long forgotten. Hand der Tafel tanzt, aber a hingerichten Wanz. Today, the devil is dancing like a hungry cockroach. Und mit dem Schild hat der Philosoph sich aufgestellt und gequält. And with that curse, the philosopher stood up so proud. Übergelot de Menschen Stimme heit, zu klären, Tacke, aber die Welt is verdreht. He left the people speechless to think as if the world was really screwed on backwards. Again, thank you for your kind participation. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to respond.
Thank you so much, Saul. That's a wonderful story. There's so much to unbox. And we've got one really good question from one of my previous students by the name of Ashbrith Reddy. Ashworth would like to know, how do you cope with losing family and friends? Do you think that your experience makes your coping mechanisms a little bit different from perhaps others?
You know, it's kind of hard to understand. Everybody deals with stress in a different way. You know, you just imagine who these people, you know, might have been and what happened to them. And it's no different that anybody that might have lost a loved one to alcoholism, or might have lost one in an automobile accident, or whatever happens. And you deal with it. You don't want to have rage as an outlet. And you just try and in their memory, carry on and be a decent human being.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. My question for you, your boys obviously are, third generation Holocaust survivor. I guess you could say we're looking at that as the Jen Shoah. What did they pick up, do you think? What were some characteristics, some lessons that you and your wife really tried to instill on your boys based on your experience as a child of survivors?
My father-in-law, Sue's dad, enlisted when the war broke out and left as a happy-go-lucky fellow, recently married, and came back a total wreck after serving in the Pacific. And it haunted him his whole life. And we both, Sue and I, tried to raise our kids kind of the way that we were raised. But my older son, Barrick, understands what we said to him. My younger son, Josh, I remember seeing the movie Swing Kids, and he was violently, really, really upset by all that happened, and really had a tough time coping with the Holocaust. He's now has his own kids, and hopefully, is bringing up his family as Barracks, as good Americans and as good Jews, and I'm proud of the way that they've handled the situation.
Well, that's excellent. Folks, if you have any questions, just post them into the YouTube chat box there and I'll relay those to you. So while we're waiting for any other questions to roll in, Saul, that's one question that I usually see my students ask of survivors and children of survivors. How did this impact your faith? Are you still very, very strong in the Jewish faith? How would you say that related?
Oh, yeah. I vividly remember my bar mitzvah. It was in July of 1960 in St. Louis. It was hot. There was no air conditioning. I grew up as a Jew. I suppose I'll die as a Jew. And in the meantime, that I also am proud to be an American and love my country. And I remember swearing for U.S. citizenship in a room with just my mom and the immigration officer, promising to uphold the Constitution and to protect my country. And I firmly believe that.
I suppose the Captain America poster behind you has nothing to do with anything of that nature.
There it is.
Yep, there you go.
Yep.
You took it very seriously. And we're very proud of you. We're proud to be able to call you an American with us.
Well, thank you.
Monica Moore says, thank you so much for sharing with us. Never can we forget. Absolutely. Thank you for that feedback, Monica. We can't forget. It's another reason why we've been putting this program on for, over 20 years. And I'm so glad that we have folks like Saul coming out and continuing with the importance of Holocaust education, because we truly never can forget. Especially, it's going to be important having stories such as Saul's when survivors are no longer to share their story. It's going to be up to their children and up to us as well to continue to tell the truth of the Holocaust and share these important stories and all of these important details. Holocaust denial is no joke. It's out there, it's real, and anti-Semitism is also out there and real and on the rise, unfortunately, not only internationally, but in our own country and in our own community and our own neighborhoods. So it is a constant issue that we have to continue to remember. Lightening the mood real quick here, Saul. I don't see any questions here, but I'm always curious as well. You mentioned food. So what were some big foods that you remember your parents making, your mother making, any foods or dishes that translated down and transitioned down?
Oh, yeah. Well, ironically, one thing that she made was it was a dish made with cucumbers and onions and a kind of a sweet and sour of vinegar and sugar. And I know my brother, if he's watching, remembers it well. I remember some of the soups and the chicken noodle soups that would have, the fat floating on top, and it was called Eugen, that the soup should have eyes, and made wonderful potato pancakes, all the great food. She did a great job.
I always tell all my students that that's one way that we can ensure that our history continues is through food, because
Oh, yeah.
food love is conveyed through food. So, and I see you smiling just as soon as we start talking about this. It perks you up,
Oh, yeah. Oh,
food is
yeah.
love. Food is absolute love. So I don't see any other questions here. If you folks think of anything, feel free to shoot us an email. My email is sarah.gottwallace@fsw.edu. If you want to relay any of those questions later on that you might, think about to me, I'll be happy to get with Saul and we'll get you an answer back as soon as we possibly can. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Mr. Saul? Anything that, any message outgoing for the folks that are watching?
I did want to thank the program. Is it the Wexler family?
It's the Dr. Talbot Spivak family who continues on the name.
Well, I would really like to thank them. I didn't get a chance to thank them, but really thank them for making this possible as well. And that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as far as you mentioned the Ukrainian situation at the top of the hour here when we first started speaking, just keep that in mind. Always try to be an upstander, I would say. Do you have anything that you would like to add in direction of that?
I agree 100%. Hopefully it can stop and that terrible tyrant be put out of his misery, and that we can get the world back into some kind of a decent shape again for our kids.
Yeah, I agree. It's the Ukrainian children that my heart really breaks for. So thank you so much, Saul. It was wonderful to have you. It was a pleasure to hear your story. Abram Comfort just came through with a question, and they said, did you belong into any second generation groups? Of course. Thank you.
There was a second generation group, and it's amazing when you get survivors together in one room. I remember there was an 80th birthday party for my father that they belonged to a group called the Habonim, and here was a group of about 100 survivors. The name I took a video of it, and it was called When Our Parents Were Young. And here you have a room full of survivors and their stories, and the children and what they went through, and the second generation. And the stories they shared, and it was an interesting group of kids.
Did you make any lifelong friends from that you
still? Sure. And you speak Yiddish, and you laugh, and you remember. You laugh about the good times and the bad, and you compare notes about, oh yeah, what did your dad do? Oh yeah. But the big thing that always came up in our discussions was always the food. And how they were always after you to eat more. And it was a flashpoint that kind of brought everybody together.
I've spoken with survivors previously who went into the food industry in some way, shape, or form. Some of them realized it, and I think some of them did it subconsciously without even realizing, especially food distribution. And I said, you realized that you were making sure that not only you and your family were fed, but everyone was fed. And it's, oh yeah, I never really thought of it that way. I just thought that I was, getting to see the world and have a great time at my job. So food plays a huge role. And that's part of the Jewish culture is, that nurturement, and that I don't know, it's like a warm blanket is the way that I always describe it, the way that I feel when I'm surrounded by the Jewish culture. That's just me. So thank you so much, Saul. Once again, if anyone has any questions right now, or if you have any questions in the future, feel free to email me, sarah.gottwallace@fsw.edu, and I'll be happy to relay those to Saul. Nothing's coming through right now, so I think I'm going to go ahead and say that we are complete. Thank you so much, Saul, for speaking for us. Thank you, everyone, for your delighted questions and for your attention. Our next panel is coming right up here. Let me just pull up my schedule real quick. We have got Judith Price speaking next at 2:00. So stay tuned for Judith. She is a survivor of the Holocaust, and she'll be sharing her story with us. And we have an excellent panel set up for the rest of the week as well. So be sure to check out that full schedule at our website, our FSW auend.edu/Holocaust.